Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's discussion on effective conflict management in schools. Navigating conflict is an inevitable part of school life, but when it comes to our educational institutions, it takes on a whole new level of significance. How we manage conflicts within the school environment can profoundly impact the learning experience and the overall well-being of students and faculty alike. To shed light on this important topic, I'm delighted to be joined by two guests who bring a wealth of knowledge and experience to the table. Please join me in welcoming Emma Van Der Berg with a master's degree in educational psychology, cum laude, from Wits University, and 12 years experience in education and psychosocial support, specializing in working with adolescents in the school setting, as well as Felicity Steadman, a veteran, seasoned international mediator and trainer, joining us from Oxford in the UK. Welcome, Felicity and Emma.
Hi, Siham. Thank you for having me.
Hi, Siham. Lovely to be here.
So let's jump right in. Emma, what are you able to share about the types and kinds of conflicts you see in schools?
Sure. So I think the conflict in schools is widespread and is a natural occurrence in a school system. I think where there's people, there's conflict, and in the school system, there's lots of people. We see conflicts between all the various levels and all the in the school system. So from students, between teachers, between a student and a teacher, or between parents and students, or between parents and a teacher. We also then have other areas in the school like management, so between teachers and management, between parents and management, so it's very widespread and common. And the kinds of conflict could be between students, could be if in friendship groups, maybe some friends feeling isolated or excluded. It could be different, maybe a group bullying a student, or it could be some students showing bias or prejudice towards other students. So often where there's differences, there's conflict. And I guess between students and teachers, it would be things like marks. Maybe they feel like something was unfairly marked. Maybe they feel like a teacher's behavior towards them is unfair. A teacher might think that a student's behavior or misbehavior can cause conflict. There's just a variety of different examples of conflict within the school system. And it occurs almost daily. Sometimes it can be a small sort of conflict that arises and is easily moved forward, but other times it can manifest. And this can be seen in maybe a short argument between two, but then it's resolved and moved on, or it can escalate, and others can get involved, and it can become a bullying or exclusion. It can happen it can happen on the sports field, it can happen in the classroom, it can happen online, it can happen outside of the school. So, it's just very widespread and daily occurrence. And then the other thing I've noticed within the school system is that a school kind of has like a flow, as we work very much in termly structure. We tend to have this kind of flow of stress levels, and conflict comes with the stress levels. So as the stress is kind of picking up in the school, often more times we see conflict in those times. I think as teachers and students get tired and stressed, the emotional regulation seems to dip, and the ability to manage their emotions and the conflicts seem to escalate. The other thing that seems to aggravate or conflict is time. Schools don't have a lot of time within the day. So you're going between periods. So let's say if you have a conflict in your classroom, it's difficult to manage it. Then you've got another class coming in, or you've got a meeting, or so time can sort of be a hindrance to conflict management. Finding the right spaces could also be quite difficult. If you want to manage a conflict, but other children are coming in, you don't necessarily want them to hear, or maybe go and spread that to others about what's happening. Or so space can also be quite challenging in a school to find. And then also because there's so many people involved, sometimes others can almost contribute to the conflict carrying on. So we find that also with social media, it can be spread quite wide and fast and can escalate quite quickly. And with social media, this can happen. A conflict could happen in the day. We think it's squished, and then the next day we find out, over the course of the night, or it's become escalated. So I just feel like it's very common, very widespread, and not necessarily ever sort of taught as a skill for teachers, and even for myself as an educational psychologist. We often find that school psychologists are often put as one of the people that would manage a conflict when it escalates. Other people would be in management, but I'm not sure that skills are ever given over to us to effectively manage conflict. It's more we draw upon the skills that we've learned in our courses and from experience, but it isn't a set kind of skill that we learn in our training.
Emma, just listening to you speak made me reflect on how complex the community is surrounding a school and the conflict that comes with it. I recall one of my very early mediations that I was called upon to participate in a school, and I didn't anticipate too much. I just thought, okay, this is a workplace mediation as I ordinarily proceed, and I was quite surprised at how complex and layered the school community is, and with that, the complexity of the conflict gets more difficult to navigate. So just listening to you reflect on, conflict applying to students, staff, parents, governing bodies, all of these very interwoven participants in a school structure does make it more difficult to navigate. Felicity, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yes. Well, I really found the way that Emma explained the ways in which conflict shows up in school, the triggers, what makes it worse, what can make it better, but also some of the causes, very interesting, because as mediators, we are often just presented with the dispute, with the conflict. So we come in like you, Siham, we're told this is a workplace dispute. And quite quickly we realize that we need a much deeper conflict analysis, really looking back. And so Emma's highlighted, for example, just understanding that the term time can contribute, can be part of the cause of people's emotions being very frayed. And so being more analytical is very, very important. And when you're more analytical about the dispute and you don't just think about the presenting problem, you immediately understand that there are different ways of dealing with a dispute, with a conflict. And I remember a conflict between my two sons many, many years ago, Oliver and Robert, and it's one we often use in our training because it highlights the importance of thinking through the options when you have a conflict. They were in a conflict on a Friday night over whose video would be watched first. And that was in the days of, only one video machine in the house, no sort of streaming, that sort of thing. And on a Friday night, they'd each get a video. And of course, they'd immediately start arguing over whose video would be watched first. So they turned to me, and I have a number of responses. I could engage. I could say, I've had enough. It's a Friday night. We do this every Friday night. I'm taking the videos back to the video store. And I could just end the dispute at that point and force my will, and they would both lose. It would be a lose-lose for both of them. And that would be essentially them avoiding dealing with the dispute. Oliver could turn to Robert and say, I'm the elder, and I'm going to beat you up if you don't let me go first. And it would be a win-lose, with Oliver winning and Robert losing. Alternatively, Rob could say, Mum loves me more than you, as kids often do. She'll let me go first, and I could have ruled in favor of Rob. Or I could have said, look, can't you go 50-50, sort this out in some sort of 50-50 way, a kind of bargaining, haggling, which would have led them both to a kind of miserable compromise, as we often talk about. It could have meant me this night, him, one child this night, one child the next night, but they'd each have to wait a week before they went first. Alternatively, and in fact, what I did in this situation is I said, now, hang on a minute. Why are you arguing over this video? I said to the little one, well, Rob, why are you so adamant that you want to go first? And he said, well, I just like putting the video into the video machine and seeing all the lights come on, and then, and pressing the button and hearing the whoosh of the video going into the machine. And that's all I want to do. He was only about 3 at the time. Oliver, on the other hand, was 5, and he was already involved with a school activity on Saturday mornings, and he wanted to watch the latest video so he could tell his friends he'd watched the video. So their needs were completely different. So, of course, the obvious answer is let Oliver go first and let Rob put the video in. So Rob gets to put the video in twice, and Oliver gets his need to go first satisfied. So, really understanding what is important rather than just applying a decision like I could have done in both cases, or I could have taken the video back, which would result in an outcome that wouldn't suit anybody. And so when you think about a school and you think about discipline is often that win-lose outcome where action is taken against one and there's punishment, or it certainly feels like that for the child. It reminds me too of a lovely example called the orange example. And this is about getting to the real needs, where a mother is with her 2 children and they're arguing over an orange, and there's only one orange and they both want it. And the mother says, for heaven's sake, let me just cut it in half and you can each have half. And they're even more frustrated with her. So she stops and takes a moment to find out, well, why do you both want this orange? And the one child wants the orange because she wants to bake a cake and she needs the zest. The other one wants to drink the orange juice because she's feeling a cold coming on and she's thirsty. So, of course, natural answer is not to cut it in half. That's, again, the suboptimal outcome. It's the win-win, which is zest it first and then juice it. So these 2 examples give you a sense, hopefully, that understanding what the drivers are is very important. And then taking time with the people involved to work out a solution that really works for them. And I think that's where conflict resolution, conflict management comes in so well, to help people take responsibility and ownership for the dispute, the conflict, and for the outcome. And they're much more empowered and more likely to actually comply with what they've agreed than when someone imposes an outcome.
Felicity, what you've shared is so helpful and interesting in terms of reflecting on how to approach conflict in trying to understand and analyze the problem before you, and really looking at it in terms of conflict management and not conflict response, which I think is what people often do, especially perhaps in a school situation where you want to come up with a decision very quickly, but it doesn't mean it necessarily is sustainable or it speaks to the needs of the parties involved. And I think it really is helpful to understand what the root causes are of those conflicts so that you can tailor your solutions to address those needs And more importantly, in a school, Emma, you mentioned how times constrained you are and how little free time there is in a school day. You really want to sort of prevent recurrence and share that problem solving and not really let it fall on you to just make that decision. And in that way, hopefully you can allocate resources more effectively. And what do you think would happen if schools didn't address conflict constructively? Felicity, I don't know if you'd like to chat to that a bit.
Yes, if schools don't address conflict effectively, well, that's also part of the analysis that needs to happen before you decide what to do. Because if you do nothing, of course, it can get worse. It can, I suppose Emma might give us some examples of how it can resolve itself, but it can often escalate and get worse. And so then thinking about, well, what's the best alternative to a potentially negotiated agreement, or what's the worst alternative? And people often or underestimate, let's say, how bad things can get, or overestimate or have an overconfidence about how they will ride out this difficult moment. But think, for example, about the coverage last year, I think it was, about the conflict between two boys on the rugby field over an alleged comment made by one to the other, and how that escalated very, very quickly into, first of all, the event being cancelled, and then litigation and media coverage, incredible amount of media coverage. And what that did for the reputation of the individuals involved, as well as for the schools. Then, of course, from the point of view of staff, teacher, admin conflict, think about the cost to a school of losing a valued teacher, of losing a valued admin person, and the recruitment costs, let alone any sort of settlement costs that there might be, and the related reputational damage. So, and I think also schools these days are so much more aware of their obligation from a safety point of view, and to do no harm. They have the lives of children in their hands, and also, I think more so than in the past, they have vigilant parents who are on the edges watching what's happening. So being conflict competent and having the skills to nip conflict in the bud, but also deal with it when it becomes difficult, is absolutely essential to the skill set of schools.
Absolutely. And maybe let's bring Emma in here and into the discussion. Emma, some of your, through your experience, when conflict hasn't been managed well, what has happened? Do you have some examples you could share with us there?
Yeah, sure. So I think there's a few examples, but it's similar to that story that you were talking about. So I'm thinking of another case in that something, so remarks made in a classroom. The conflict wasn't managed in that moment. And then so it's almost like a rippling effect. So then that incident verbally goes around the schools with people talking, did you hear what this person said? Okay, then again, not addressed. And then it becomes on social media. And then it's very difficult because it's, like you say, school's reputation, the individual's reputation, in this case, a teacher's reputation and livelihood, the teacher's job on the line. It's disciplinary hearings, it's, HR's involved, marketing teams involved, management's involved, parents are involved. It ropes in a lot of people, it's a lot of time, resources, energy, and then just emotional toll on those involved in the conflict. And the escalation can happen quite fast but the conflict takes a long time to resolve. And yeah, so and also for the students, just think it's emotional toll, but it's also the academic toll on the academics. It could cause friendship losses, which for a teenager is quite big at that stage. Social isolation it could cause. So there's a lot on the line when a seeming moment happens that then could escalate quite quickly and take a toll quite quickly, and also change your life in a lot of ways quite quickly. So I think it's I do think that it's not often considered the ramifications of seemingly small conflicts.
Thanks, Emma. It was really helpful to have those sorts of illustrations, because we don't realize or remember, because it's been such a long time ago, the impact of these conflicts on these young children, especially with social media exacerbating it quite intensively. From our discussion. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
So yeah,
please.
just that's been the one major shift I've seen over the years, is the communication. So the lack of communication usually seems to be involved in conflict, and the communication that occurs is always online. So even if they are close together, the teenagers, they tend to communicate online. So it's a big shift in how they communicate and how they express their anger and fight with one another, which has also been a bit of a change. And I think it can sometimes escalate things, because not always the communication is difficult. The tone of what someone is saying. Also the fact that they can screenshot and then send, and it just ropes in more people, or can widespread. So it has changed in that way.
That's really helpful to understand, because you're juggling so many different variables in managing a conflict effectively in a school situation. Just to summarize where we are in this conversation, Emma so helpfully pointed out the various conflicts at school and the triggers that bring it about and who it affects in the school situation. And then Felicity drew our attention to how to effectively analyze a conflict and what happens in terms of the risk of not managing that conflict effectively. So now it can seem like an overwhelming problem. And I was wondering, Felicity, if you can shed some light from your extensive experience on what schools can do to undertake to address conflicts, looking at them all the way from the causes through to the symptoms. How can they respond effectively or feel more confident in terms of managing the conflict and feel better equipped to deal with it?
Yes, well, I think starting with causes, there's a huge opportunity for conflict management training in schools. So training at the level of teachers and staff in in understanding conflict, enhancing their conflict management skills at the level of basic communication skills like listening, dealing with emotion in the classroom, problem-solving situations that arise. And the kinds of conflicts they could apply those skills to would be conflicts with pupils, conflicts with parents, and that's something we've done a lot of training in, how to have difficult conversations with parents relating to their children. And then, of course, there's a lot you can do with the pupils themselves. And Siham, perhaps you can relate here your experience in Peacemaker or Fussbuster training in schools with pupils and equipping them with conflict management skills.
Yes, Felicity, we had a fantastic opportunity actually with the Conflict Dynamics Trust last year, which has the Peacemaker program, where a number of your conflict dynamics trainers got together and put together a Peacemaker project aimed at the students. And it was the leadership of the schools, the prefects, where they were trained in peer mediation skills. And they found it really helpful to look at problems differently. Many of them wanted to go ahead and make representations to the school on how to change their policy so that they could introduce a peer mediation program into their school. Some of them came up with an advocacy program to teach and inform their fellow students on a different way to approach conflict. And I think that goes back very nicely to what you were talking about, Emma, about the resources in the school, because now you've got, in this case, it was prefects who would be almost like your first line of engagement, where there's a small scuffle that emerged on how to address it there before it gets escalated up to a teacher. So we found the interaction profoundly insightful, and we were surprised at how quickly the students grasped it and embraced conflict management techniques and dispute resolution techniques with quite a lot of ease. So it was a very fruitful program, and we're hoping to see more schools embrace it in terms of how they would like to manage discipline in the schools rather than a very punitive or adversarial system. So that was a very helpful project that happened last year.
Well, we've talked about training for teachers and staff, as well as training for students. Then, of course, there's the opportunity to use external mediators and facilitators for more intransigent actual disputes. So using mediators, such as the example you gave at the beginning of our discussion, Siham, about mediating a dispute between, in that case, staff members, but also perhaps mediating in complex matters involving the school and students. And as I understand it, the example I gave earlier, the slur on the rugby field, was one such mediated conflict. And then there are also opportunities to use external facilitators and mediators for whole school reviews of conflict and reviews of challenges, for example, around transformation, where a school is really grappling with issues relating to identity and cultural change. The use of a third party to facilitate those, to design a process, really understand what the problem is, and then facilitate a process, can be very helpful, because of course it's difficult where you've got a multi-stakeholder situation to have one of those stakeholders facilitating that sort of conversation. So the mediator would bring to bear all those good conflict management and negotiation skills that we would also train people within the schools to achieve.
Felicity, coming from abroad, do you have any insights of what's happening in conflict management in the UK or US, or even around peer mediation? Do you have any international insights that you could share with us?
Yes, certainly in the UK and in the US more earlier than in the UK, there are very established peer mediation programs. And they are sometimes referred to as fussbuster programs or mediator managers, mediation managers. So students are trained, a cohort of students is trained within a school to mediate disputes. And it's not just high school, it can be junior school as well, to mediate the types of disputes that develop between students on a regular basis at school. And it's lovely to see, because they have a code of conduct, a process, a room set aside. Emma mentioned the problem around facilities, so a room that's set aside for the mediation, which encourages talking openly, listening actively, adhering to confidentiality, because we know how rumors and so on can really beset these sorts of conflicts. And they do extremely well. In fact, there's a competition in the UK where schools that are doing well in peer mediation programs compete against one another and, you know, are rewarded for the progress that they've made. So I think there's a lot we could do in South Africa to apply these skills and to enrich the conflict management process in schools.
Emma, what are your thoughts about what Felicity has shared in terms of ways to approach conflict management in schools and some of the interesting examples she shared about what's happening in schools in the US and UK? Do you think some of those ideas would be helpful for our schools in South Africa?
Absolutely, yeah. So I'm very interested to hear about the peer program. Just because just working within a school, I noticed that, well, firstly, I think it's more likely that a peer will come across conflict in some ways just because the teachers can't be everywhere all the time. And a lot of times the conflict is happening, so, you know, at breaks or after school, things like that. So that's the one thing. And second thing is that at the school bearing age, there's they often are more influenced by their peers than they would be by an adult. So to have a peer involved, I think is puts them at ease, number one, that there's not a power shift in some ways, that and also it's more relatable. I think that sounds amazing. And then the other thing I just wanted to ask was, there's also been a shift in South African schools to restorative justice model, where there's no longer kind of like punitive discipline, and schools are looking at trying to apply restorative justice. And I think there is a need for maybe upskilling of those involved in the restorative justice. So that would be the management or whoever's involved in the disciplinary structures of the school, restorative justice structures. And would you see some training being beneficial there? It sounds like it would really be helpful in the South African school systems at the moment.
Yeah, I think that often people assume that good communication skills, understanding interests and needs are a natural skill that we all have. But I think it's true to say that given a tense moment in a tense conversation, you can't rely on those skills presenting themselves. It's often that you know, we often resort to our sort of innate responses, which aren't necessarily always as constructive. So taking some time to learn the skills to use in the restorative justice process would really be time well spent.
I think what I'm hearing you say, Felicity and Emma, is that a comprehensive conflict management strategy needs to be considered, because if one school simply, you know, trains peer mediators for the students, but not restorative practice skills to the teachers, or doesn't embrace a workplace mediation method of dispute resolution in how they manage their labor disputes, it could all seem a little bit fragmented and less effective. So what you'd like to see is a more coordinated approach where the policies speak to each other and really set it up for success in terms of how you're going to manage that conflict in the school comprehensively and in a way that is very synchronized and coordinated with each other. Emma, do you have any last thoughts before we wrap up our conversation?
I'm just excited as the prospect of, you know, maybe in taking on board some of these teachings that you've had today to the school system. I think they're hugely beneficial. Yeah, and it's just exciting to learn new things and to hear how it could be applied in the education system. I think it's been very, very helpful. And yeah, thank you so much for involving me and for your time. I've learned a lot today and I'm very appreciative of it.
And from your side, Felicity, any last thoughts?
I think I just know from many years of practice as a mediator that effective conflict management skills can really turn a negative situation into something positive. And as Emma said at the beginning, conflict will always be there because there are people. So how do we manage those situations in a way that produces a good outcome for both parties, but also doesn't damage the relationship going forward, because very often that is one of the major consequences of these sorts of conflicts. You might find a solution, or someone might impose a solution, but the relationship is damaged so that they actually can't work together very well in the future. So thank you.
And that brings us to the end of our insightful discussion. I want to extend a heartfelt thank you to our guests, Emma and Felicity, for sharing their expertise and valuable insights today. Your perspectives have highlighted the importance of effective conflict management in schools. My takeaway is that it's a journey towards creating positive and inclusive school environments. It begins with understanding and effectively managing these conflicts. Let's continue to work together, fostering environments where every student and educator feels valued and supported.